So we're talking.
Okay, I'll just tell you.
How
My first day.
curriculum instruction is here to carry out.
Very, yeah, so, I left the topic a little bit broad to kind of share the audience.
Okay, you're going on email.
And Dr. This is Dr. Couch.
How are you doing?
But we
Nice to meet you.
Couch is a sociology thing.
Well, no, I said one of Dr. is interviewing for you.
Florence School District.
Right, so the ones that are completed are being processed.
And so, I don't know
Some of them
how
are
to do
available
that at
at
all.
home.
And
Yeah.
like they're automatic, right?
Yeah.
Well, I have no idea.
And then so talk a little bit just about.
So,
I have not for secondary education. History, that's obviously very different than how you said.
I am writing
at college level. And then jump into how you teach history in our school. There's been a lot of hubbub lately about how.
yeah, I would
always forget to unmute for the live stream. All right. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll just jump right in with any questions that you all in the audience have. We don't have any planned dialogue necessarily, so you can just start with your questions. So Dr. Todd Couch is an assistant professor of sociology at Francis Marion University. His research focuses on the influence of racial and ethnic ideologies in shaping social movements. Dr. Couch's most recent article, Concealed Carry on Campus as an Expression of Racialized Vulnerability, was published in Sociology. His research has also been featured in Issues in Race and Society and Sociological Research Online. Outside of higher education, Dr. Couch works with multinational corporations as a diversity and inclusion consultant. Most recently, he offered a series of inclusion trainings for EHS Home Appliances, the largest manufacturer of home appliances in Europe. Dr. Couch also serves on the board of directors for the Darlington County Habitat for Humanity. Dr. Louis Venters teaches African and African diaspora history, U.S. history, and public history at Francis Marion University. Dr. Venters is also a consultant in the fields of historic preservation and cultural resource management. He is the author of No Jim Crow Church, The Origins of South Carolina's Baha'i Community, and a History of the Baha'i Faith in South Carolina, and is co-author of a number of exhibits, tours, and site reports, including the Green Book of South Carolina, a multiple award-winning mobile travel guide to African American historic sites. And it can be found online at greenbookofsouthcarolina.com. And Dr. Katrina Rouse graduated from the College of Charleston in 2001 with her Bachelor of Science degree in Education. Later in 2006, she received a master's degree from Cambridge College in Literacy Education. In 2014, she earned an Education Specialist degree and Superintendent Administration and a Principalship graduate certificate from Arkansas State University. Most recently, she graduated in August 2021 from University of South Carolina with her Doctorate of Education in Curriculum and Instruction. Dr. Rouse has been an educator with Florence One Schools for 21 years. Currently, she serves as the K-12 District Social Studies Coordinator and is president of the South Carolina Social Studies Supervisors Association. She has served as chairman of the Diversity Board at Studies Weekly and has written curricula with the company for several states. Additionally, she is a member of the board with the Joan Trumpier Mulholland Foundation and serves as curriculum advisor. She is a member of the Florence Alumna Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And so with that, we will get started. If anyone has any initial questions, you can feel free to jump right in. If not, I always have questions, so I will jump in, but feel free to ask a question. Get started.
Yes, I think that's a question for me. I'm trying to get some more understanding myself for it. I've seen in the news as far as the term critical race theory. In the enlightenment, it's like I think they say they don't want it taught in the schools. Is that correct?
Sorry, the big one's here.
Yeah, let's go straight to it.
I know.
Come on.
So critical race theory, to understand that term, we have to really go back to the 1970s. That during the 1960s, we have these series of progressive movements, things like civil rights, women's rights, things like that. During the late 70s, we start to have it's a multiracial collection of legal scholars come together under what is called critical legal studies, CLS. And the purpose of CLS was really trying to evaluate how well the laws that had been passed in the 60s were being implemented. And so they began to advance this idea called legal realism. And what legal realism asks is, does what a law say matter, or should we be more focused on how laws actually play out in the courtroom? And so that became the crux of CLS. Well, moving up into the 1980s, the CLS movement begins to advocate for what is called rights trashing. Rights trashing became the idea that rights themselves don't necessarily matter, because many of the rights that had been granted during the 1960s were not necessarily playing out well in the courtroom. Well, this created a split within CLS because many of the scholars of color that were in that movement had been civil rights lawyers during the 60s and had fought for those rights. So this split is the beginning of critical race theory. So critical race theory, in essence, is a collection of scholars of color that have really fought during the 1960s, asking questions about the ability of law to produce the type of social change that they were actually striving for. That's critical race theory. It's not necessarily that scary. It's really a matter of legal scholars asking questions about how well the legal system can create the long-term sustained change that the civil rights movement was trying to advance.
And if you'd like, I can tell you a little bit of how that's come down from that level to the general public and school systems. Some of the tenets of critical race theory is, one is race is a social construct. It's not biological. And so you have that discussion. Another being that race is inherent in any society. And so teaching that America is inherently racist, because it's in every society, there's a social hierarchy that develops in any group. I mean, we teach our sixth graders about Mesopotamians and, Sumerians and Egyptians and feudalism as we get further along. There's always been a social hierarchy. But when we apply that to America, it gets touchy. So that's where the problem is coming in. And so additionally, one of the other tenets is the fact that institutional racism or systemic racism is real. A lot of the issues we're having today stem from laws that were put in place in the beginning. You can go all the way back to slave codes, black codes, and track this all the way up to stop and frisk. It continues to move on. And so it becomes touchy when we make those connections, and they're afraid if we make those connections in the classroom, we're going to paint America in a bad light. And we're going to cause some people to feel uncomfortable with the truth of the founding of this nation, and the same way how that's coming to light now, if you have some teachers who have decided to make connections between all these laws that are being passed for voting rights and all that. You got some teachers who are making the connection, and they don't want that to happen.
I could just add a couple thoughts. Thank you both very much. I did my PhD not terribly long ago. I graduated in 2010, and we studied all kinds of theories, all kinds of isms, all kinds of ways of organizing thought about history and society and so forth. So I sort of considered myself up to date until a couple of years ago. There's critical race theory. I'm like, in the HE double. Okay, so let me go find out what is the big deal about, how did I miss critical race theory? Okay, and so I did just enough digging to realize, oh, I see what folk are upset about. It's that the kind of historical scholarship that people in my profession have been doing for a few generations now, at least since Van Woodward and the strange career of Jim Crow in the 1950s, but really you should push it back to Du Bois and Black Reconstruction in the 30s, history, as scholars are practicing it and thinking about it, the way we're understanding the United States, is finally starting to get through to people, right? This is what the controversy is. There is not a thing that is new about so-called critical race theory. So what Dr. Couch explained is the specific literal meaning of it, but the way The controversy is, it's actually not about critical race theory. Try and pay some money to somebody on the street who's exercised about all this to explain what critical race theory is. And what they say is not critical race theory. What they end up talking about is other things that they are upset about, that folk are getting them exercised over, right? They're anxious about class, about race, about how to make it in this society, the feeling that the elites are, you know, out of control, that you all a list of stuff, right? But it's not actually, doesn't have a whole lot to do with critical race theory. But it is starting to get like the best of the historical scholarship is starting to make a difference. And this is a reaction to it. It's just folk uncomfortable with looking at the United States in a critical way, right? If we've been taught that history is like a static thing, it's, you know, it's the facts that I learned in my textbook when I was a kid, and nobody better come along and start messing with that, or else that's not history, or you're trying to revise history, God forbid. I mean, I hate to say that the way science works, and that includes the social sciences, the study of human beings, the way science works is that, you know, you posit some ideas, right? Folk do their scholarship, right? Other folk a generation later come back and look at their work and say, well, that was really smart, but, you know, I've got a different question, so let me think about this, and we're going to study some more. And then folk a generation after that come back and say, oh, I love all of y'all, appreciate it, but that was wrong, and so let's think of a different question. Let's look at these sources differently. Let's, you know, use different eyes to see this. And so, of course, history changes. If we look at our past the same way today as our ancestors did 100 years ago, I mean, what a waste of 100 years. Like, I hope we're asking better questions now than they did then. That is science.
Doesn't that also have to do with who gets to ask the questions?
Oh, I mean, certainly. And if, since, so I brought up those, you know, 100 years, right? Who were historians 100 years ago? I guess there were a handful of women, white women, who were professional historians 100 years ago. But I'm not exaggerating when I say probably a handful. And folk who weren't white, who were trying to do professional historical scholarship, I mean, it was just few and far between. And the white people who were, you know, in control of the profession didn't read W.B. Du Bois. They didn't read Chancellor Williams. They didn't read Black historians, right? So these innovations were starting to take place at the margins of the profession, but it's in these 100 years that now, I mean, obviously we still have a number of problems with the way higher education functions and questions of access and so forth, but the civil rights movement completely changed the historical profession. The kinds of questions that everybody gets to ask now, the different kinds of people who are allowed to ask the questions in a professional setting and have their voices heard and make a difference in the discourse. I'm not claiming that everything is fine in the historical profession, but relatively speaking, like, it's night and day. In these 100 years, there's the historical profession before the civil rights movement, and there's the historical profession after the civil rights movement, and it's two different planets. Thank God.
And there are one conversation I've had along those lines about who gets to ask the questions with a couple of teachers who've asked me. I say, you do realize there are critical theories for lots of other things. Race is one lens. And I said, just think about what's happened, like you said, what's happened in the last 100 years. And so let's take women. And so that's, when we talk about women's studies, there's no pushback there. There's no pushback there. And so some of the areas are touchy and others are not. And so that's just how we have to do things when it comes down to the school level. And I think what's also happened, as you said, how it's turned social sciences on its head, at the collegiate level, that's trickled down to high school. And what's happening is not that teachers are teaching critical race theory. What's happening is now we're looking at perspectives of other groups in the country. We're not starting with Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We're starting with the first people who were here, and we're looking at their perspective. And then we have all of the explorers coming, and we think about their motives for coming here. What happened when they arrived? And then even with what they brought with them. Okay, so they bring in families. Let's think about the perspective of women at the time. And we started doing that in history some years ago. I remember before there were social studies standards. I'm aging myself here. But we got the standards. The first set I recall specifically was in '05. They were very, just general stuff you've always learned. And then in 2011, we started looking more at perspectives. We always have to look at women, Native Americans, African Americans. Those are the groups you have to look at. And you always break down your other group, your white men, into the elite and the non-elite. So those are the 5 groups we always looked at. They rewrote the standards in 2019. I was on the committee after they got so much pushback to let's revise them. And what we did in the new standards, now we're using the skills of the historian. So now students are asked to make connections. They're looking at change over time. They're asked to compare. They're asked to look at causation. They're asked to look at contextualization, which nobody knew what that was. We've been doing it forever. It's just that we didn't put a name to it. And so, so periodization. So now they're taking those skills of the historian that were normally taught in college, they're bringing them down to the high school level. You're saying who's asking questions? Our high schoolers sometimes are asking questions. And your little kids, believe it or not, ask questions. And so now we're using these tools and we start digging, but we can't dig too deep.
I think I come from I've been an elementary school teacher forever, and now I'm teaching elementary social studies methods. So I know when we came out with the standards in 2011, it would say, what did George Washington, James Madison, da 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 do, and how did this affect women, African Americans, and Native Americans?
Right.
A little short thing you had to, And there really wasn't a lot. I remember we had to learn about Jane Addams, and the important thing was she supported her husband.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. So, there wasn't a lot, and now we're trying to look from the perspective of other people and telling other people's stories. And I think that's where it's almost getting a little scary for some people.
It is, but what they've done is they've broadened them so much. Because when they first came out, how standards are created is this. They have a call for people, we're revising our standards, anybody want to come help work on them, and they choose teachers, community members, lawmakers, all the constituents of the state have an opportunity to be on a committee to help revise standards. Then they go out for public review. Depending on public review, and they also have to be passed, standards are laws, so they go through the legislative process as well. So you have public review and they have to go through the legislative process. And the lawmakers will turn the standards around and tell you to rewrite it. And when I tell you, you get feedback from everybody under the sun, you can get feedback from Jewish societies. When they first redid the standards, The Holocaust, I'm trying to think, was it mentioned in the 2019 standards? It was, it was lumped in as a general atrocity or genocide around the world. So we were trying to get away from being super specific to name, look at Jane Addams, look at this person, look at that person, to say, let's look at generally, holistic. The problem with that is then you put it in the laps of the teachers and schools to kind of pick and choose. That can be an issue depending on who they pick and who they choose. And so now we've just come out with an alignment guide in 2020 to go with the new standards of 2019 because they were so broad. It was like, so what exactly am I supposed to be teaching here? You know? And so that alignment guide kind of gives them some background and gives them the bullet points, some people to make sure you touch. So that's where we are. But they get public review and they have to go through the legislative process. And then once they are adopted, and here's how we have to work. State Department passing standards. The goal is to get them adopted. Once you get them into law, then you can make all the supplements you want. But you can't try to stuff everything you want to say in them because they'll never get passed. And so that's how that works. So as kids are being asked to do skills-based social studies at all levels, not just in history, geography, economics, government. They're using the skills of the political scientists, the skills of geographers, so on and so forth.
I don't know that. So what kind of discretion do educators have on selecting, say, primary sources they want to use, or say the social studies coordinator in a school or in a school district, how much say do they have over which textbook is selected? Because those can really impact how these things are being taught if you're asking the students to use skills to assess them.
With textbooks, the state has a selection of textbooks that they approve. We're in the middle of that process right now. And I'm going to tell you, it's not a perfect process because a lot of times you get standards and you don't get textbooks for years later, so people are pulling resources. My job is part of that, pulling the resources. And so this last round of textbook adoption for social studies, there was some public review issues with what was going into the 4th, 5th, and 8th grade textbooks, which are U.S. and South Carolina history for elementary. And they pulled them all. We were supposed to have a caravan and go see them, and they cut all that out. Well, now we've got one publisher that's been pushed through now that we could buy if we want. So that's how textbooks are selected for the state. However, districts have their own funds. I can go out and find a textbook that the board, that Florence Warren's board will approve. And if we've got the money, we just buy it straight out and circumvent the state altogether. You can do that. But all textbooks go through some kind of approval process. I know in Florence One, how we've done it is publishers bring us samples. For instance, that new book that I told you, that new 4th and 5th grade book, that publisher, I tell you, it's a race. They'll come sit down, have lunch, and share the books. And we send it out to the schools. And I said, can you just send me samples, one for every one of the teachers here? And they get the samples. And then usually I follow that up with a survey where I'm asking them to survey one chapter. I'm not asking you to read the whole book. We don't have time for that. But survey a chapter or a section. See how well it aligns with our standards and our alignment guide. Now, I do the same thing with it. I mean, I'm not just putting it all on teachers. I do it too. However, I don't get necessarily have the deciding vote. You know, I can weigh in on it. And so teachers look at it and they make a choice. But ultimately, now the textbook decision comes down. What teachers say, we take into their account, take into my account, superintendent comes in and looks as well. And so if we're gonna buy it with our money, that's how you decide. If you're gonna buy it with state money, the state usually gives you a couple of options. So like, for instance, I think right now we have 2 publishers. I think Pearson is one, but they're not Pearson anymore. Savas and Gibbs Smith are the two publishers that made it through all the rounds, and they're on the state list. Schools could choose what they want to buy. So that's how textbooks are chosen. But anybody can write a textbook.
I was gonna say, as a teacher, I don't know, I mean, we have the textbooks sitting in the big pile in the corner, but for one, I taught fourth grade, they were way too hard. They were not particularly on our standards, and they never got used. I mean, we picked them out and said, look at a picture of this, and let's put it back up, and we'll use it next month. So we tell our education people, what we have to teach is a state standard, we have to do this. Your pedagogy, how you teach is up to you. So that's where, again, it gets a little sticky.
And then it gets sticky when they get to the district, because I don't know, it depends on the district they work in. You have some schools and districts that dictate, this is the book, this is the curriculum we use, do not deviate from that. Okay, you have that. However, in Florence 1, I write curriculum. And I get teachers to help. So like, we got new standards, get some teachers, let's break these down, let's analyze. I go school to school, professional development, but how to break down these standards, what are the intent, what do they mean? And then we pull all sorts of resources. We teach that the book is a resource. It is one resource. You can use other stuff. I used to tell them all the time, my favorite saying, listen y'all, there's a million ways to skin a cat, and I'm not advocating violence against animals. But at the end of the day, how you get there is completely up to you. Just give me a skin cat, okay? So that's how, you do. But I've heard some other places where they dictate, they say teachers are in lockstep.
So another question to all of you. So my social studies getting ready to be teachers are like, okay, we hear you, we hear that we need to be teaching these other perspectives, but I'm scared. What happens when I go out into the schools and parents complain or principals complain or that sort of thing?
They're covered by state standards. That's their covering. Because if our state standards say, we're looking at the perspectives of marginalized groups, because that's the term they're using in these new standards, then they're covered. What you have to be careful of is not politicizing anything. That's where you see the teachers in the news. The ones who decide to not just present, as I say, just present the facts, allow kids to make up their minds. What was the time period like? What were the beliefs of people during that period? What were the living conditions like? What was the economic status of certain folk in this time? How might their perspective differ from somebody who's at a different status? That's how they have the conversation. Then if you're going to bring that up to today, you can ask them to make some connections and only discuss what you can prove in fact. Talk about population. We can't argue about population. I mean, really. Talk about geography of where people live. How might the geography of where someone lives impact what economic opportunities are there? Okay, that's something no one can really argue about. So that's how they attack it. And then they can start making comparisons. Now, what's going to happen is, depend on the level of the student. I'm currently, I'm so grateful that we get to double duty when we feel like it. So I'm K-12 coordinator, so I'm still responsible for all the social studies, but I decided I wanted to give these new standards a run. So I'm actually teaching U.S. history to juniors and seniors right now.
Cool.
And let me tell you, they make connections. And what you say is, I hear you, and you're onto something there. And you're right, if we're talking about different sides of the spectrum, here's what you hear, and you know how I turned it around? How does that relate to Federalists and anti-Federalists that we've been discussing? So now I brought it back to a different time period, so it's not as offensive. And if they get into something that could be tightrope territory, say, you know what, I want you to put a pin in it. I'd love for you to go home and discuss that with your parents.
Which may become a disaster, right? Because that could be how the school board ends up having people, I mean, some of these horror stories of like violence in our school board meetings. So I mean, I hear everything you're saying, and
I'm just saying, I have a whole PD called How Not to Get Fired, and that's how not to get fired.
That's great.
Well, but I think something that Lou just mentioned is incredibly important here, and it's some of the school board videos that we've seen over the last year or so, right? And I think part of a way to understand those is thinking about the stories that we tell and the impacts of the stories that we tell, those historical and cultural narratives. That what's the function of narrative, right? That it gives us a sense of thinking about who we are. And that what if who we think we are is not necessarily who we are. That I think about what's sometimes called civic religion. And it's the idea that our civics and like our identity and thinking of self has religious characteristics. And so what if I tell you that like your civic theology is wrong, or that there are things about your civic theology that don't necessarily check out in some ways? That I was talking with students a couple years ago when Kaepernick was in the news and things of that nature. And I said, of course, you know, there are issues relative to policing that are getting people upset. I said, but think about it from the context of civic religion. That what does taking a knee before a flag do if we think about civics in a religious context? I said, we could think about it perhaps as walking into a Catholic church and dumping out the holy water at the door, right? And so the thing about history is that it carries with it these stories and these mythologies that shape our sense of identity, our sense of self. And what happens when perhaps the stories that we've been told do not necessarily line up with who we've been told we are? That creates an internal crisis. It's an identity crisis. Who are we? And we have two choices, right? That we can step into that, or we can recoil and dig our heels in. And that I think as we see issues at the school boards, we're seeing some of the decisions that people are making and how they're coping with that identity crisis.
I never thought about that. I like that. That's awesome. You're so right. Both sides, digging your heels in and stepping forward.
Have y'all seen the 5 different bills that are going to?
I just shared that I got that email about last week. There,
The South Carolina legislature.
yeah, there are 5 bills headed to the floor.
If you read their tenets of what CRT is, they're not. I mean, they're not.
They're not CRT.
No, they're not. They're a little more balanced. I mean, they're not. If people really could do this, we'd be okay. They're not out of the ordinary, but I feel like that's not the way it'll be policed. So.
I think some of it is curbing. Looking at those bills, to me, you're curbing the thought process. You're curbing the right to question identity. I mean, like you said, you're pulling into question everything I've ever known. And so and they're kids. And so you got to think about, you're not just questioning some idea, you're questioning how I may have been raised, my family history, genealogy. That's hard. So, but you're right. There these bills out here. A lot of it's not crazy. You're like, well, who's teaching that anyway now at school?
Will one or some of you share some of the bills that are currently being, I shouldn't say pushed, but discussed and carried through the legislative process right now?
This is what the staff attorney said that CRT is, and so this is how they start correcting these bills. And there's 8 of them, I'll just do a couple. Any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is is inherently superior or inferior. So if you believe that one race is superior or inferior over the other, then that's critical race.
But that's how they're defining it in the law.
What that means is, what's not being said is that you have been teaching that white people are less than. And that shall be against the law.
That's a fear.
Which is not what has been taught, right? We're talking about social and historical processes, but I mean, I haven't read through this current batch. I have looked at the ones that pertain to higher ed that just came through last year, right? And this is the subtext of those, and so I imagine we're talking about the same thing.
I can give you the bill numbers if you all want to go look them up. The first one is H4325, Critical Race Theory Instruction Prohibition. H4325, Critical Race Theory Instruction Prohibition. Okay, the second one that has been brought to my attention is H.4343, Academic Integrity Act. Okay, yep. H.4392, Partisanship Out of Civics Act.
Could you repeat that?
H4392, Partisanship Out of Civics Act. H4605. This is a long one. You ready? Freedom from ideological coercion and indoctrination.
Yeah.
You want me to say it again? Freedom from ideological coercion and indoctrination. And the last one, H4799, critical race theory. Now, all 5 of those have a financial impact, meaning if they are passed and policed and it is found that you are teaching something that is prohibited in any of these bills, they can pull funding. So that's the impact and the concern for school systems.
Well, and just, I mean, these are bad enough, but in Virginia, this was passed, 2 weeks ago, with a tip line so that you can tell on teachers.
Oh, yes, the hotline.
I mean, teachers don't have enough going on, but they were gonna tell them.
Well, and what's particularly interesting about one of the bills, the first bill that we missed, the prohibition bill, is that the ways that it continues to define CRT are not necessarily what CRT is. That one is that groups are not inherently inferior or superior. One is that groups should be treated differently. The other is that people today are inherently responsible for things in the past. Right? Like, those are not necessarily things that you'll get in a classroom. Another important word in that bill specifically is that that teachers cannot coerce students and force them to believe things. You've been teaching long enough, you can't make a student believe anything, right? But all of that said, what I think is perhaps the more interesting aspect of it is if these bills do get put into place, they formally define CRT as something in the law, which I think is a very dangerous place to go.
And kind of ironic it's almost like proving some of CRT's point.
Right, because now CRT is this thing in the law.
Yeah.
Where that's,
I think it is gonna set a precedent and open the floodgate for more policing of how we attempt to teach students to think. Because as teachers, that's our job. Yeah, we have to feed you some information, but we feed you the information in an effort to teach you how to be a thinker, how to be a productive member of society.
Oh, hard enough time getting teachers to stay, I can't imagine. I'm sorry, go ahead.
All of it sounds to me like all of this pushback comes from a place of like white fragility mostly. So how do we combat that in our classrooms without making parents mad? Like, I'm gonna be an English teacher. How do I choose a text that's historically important and I address the harmful narratives that it may have, or like the awful beliefs that it was written, that the author had? How do I do that? Because I have no idea. Because most of the historically foundational texts in this country, first one that comes to mind, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's not a great book. I'm gonna say, like, how do I navigate that with my students?
Well, I'm gonna tell you right now, that term is in one of these laws, white
I'm not
fragility. You
surprised.
can't make one group feel like they're fragile concerning tough topics, as we call them. I want to say, for starters, you're getting ready to teach English in most school districts, especially in this state. There's an approved list of books. Okay. Now, when you get to the topics, such as topics in Uncle Tom's Cabin, you present them with what is, and you use history to corroborate the story. So where she's talking about the horrible things experienced under, the system of slavery, let's go and have your kids say, well, let's go find some primary sources from some people and corroborate this story. What does it say about thinking at the time? How has thinking changed since then? That's how you tackle it, in a way. And you're going to have kids, you're teaching high school if you're going to be reading that. You're going to have kids question everything. Again, you got the go-to line? That's fantastic. We can talk about it later. We can do some research on your own. Share that with your parents. Because that's gonna, I know it, sometimes, let's be real, that sucks, but you also need to protect yourself, because you don't want to get put in a corner or put in a place where you're espousing your feeling, your position, on that, because that's where it gets touchy,
I'll go a little bit lighter. How do you teach, like, thinking about going into Black History Month? How do you teach that without having some form of cultural appropriation? We hear the same people every year for Black History Month. Like, how do we switch it up with these students are getting?
Oh, switch it up. Well, again, you mean you don't want to teach? Oh,
Like, I just feel like we
No.
always get Martin Luther King.
And you always get Rosa
But I
Parks.
want to get them to like.
Actually, what I can tell you, for teachers who are unaware, our new latest standards list people that I've even had principals and teachers say they never heard of. So they're getting into people like Lewis Latimer. And one thing that they're also doing, so I would tell you to do some research. You can, I don't know the website off the top of my head, but it was a great one I used to use. And my experience teaching guys is pretty much everything. Before I got my first teaching job, I taught beginning reading. Then I taught grades 4 through 6. I modeled lessons in middle school, and I taught high school U.S. history, so I've done the gamut. So it depends on what level you're at. But getting them to choose somebody they've never heard of, and doing a little bit of research on that, because it's eye-opening to share that. And another thing that I like to advocate for, when you're looking at Black History Month, and if you're going to go with our civil rights movements and things that happened. I think one thing we neglect to tell children is that it was a collective effort of lots of groups of people to help secure the rights of African Americans. And so Joan Trumpower Mulholland, I'm on that foundation as curriculum advisor. Does anybody know who she is? She is a freedom rider, and if I pop her picture up, you'd say, I've seen that picture before. She's a freedom rider. She's still alive. I've had the pleasure of meeting her, talking with her, introducing her on a national stage. And it's crazy because her son is an Emmy Award winning director. He writes documentaries, and they started based on his mom's life. He said, I never knew my mom was a freedom rider. So he's old. You know.
Say your name one more time.
Joan Trumpower, and that's Trumpauer, Mulholland, Mulholland. Her son is Loki, Loki, Mulholland.
Look,
He can tell you that he's a twin. He can tell that she tells the story of how she named her boy. But I think it's also a great idea during Black History Month or any time, because I told somebody one time was asking me about that. I said, you do know I'm Black all year round. But when you're teaching history, period, make sure to include everybody who helped the causes, okay? So, you know, also tell about people during Black History Month who may not be Black, but they definitely fought and helped the cause.
I'd just like to give a shout out too. 2 years ago, my son came home he was in 3rd grade and came home. And first I saw the booklet about Rosa Parks. I was like, oh, come on, same old thing. And then he brought home the book about Dr. King's little booklet that he had filled out. And I said, oh, come on now, we got it. And then he came home with Ruby Bridges.
Yes.
An elementary school kid in New Orleans who, you know, was the first Black student who, you know, desegregated this school. And my child could tell me all about Ruby Bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked some questions, and he did great. And then his little brother came home last year, and that's my little athlete, right? And he came home and he would not stop talking about Jackie Robinson.
Oh yeah.
Right? And so this is just a little bit of my experience in one school in one district, but just that you know, their teachers, that's a very small sample size, but you know, we're able to pull, you know, figures who, you know, some of them are lesser known, but that really, really spoke to my kids. Really made a difference to them, and I quizzed them and found it all to be quite up to par. I was really impressed. So thank you. You're doing great. And at least a couple of your teachers are too.
And y'all look for the people. Ruby Bridges is still alive.
I know.
And there are plenty of free things. You can show some little snippets of her talking about her experience at that age. You know, just like I was telling you about Miss Mulholland, she's still alive and she talks about it. And I followed them, and the last one was hilarious. They took her to a civil rights museum, and she said they had it all wrong. But you know, just continue to just keep pushing and looking for those. And another one that I think kids find interesting today are the newer people. So like people who did something now, like Mystic Copeland. You know, think about what she's done as being the first. You know.
Well, don't forget, this is Florence County, and our astronaut from Lake City.
Yeah, McRon McNair.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is always fantastic for them to see.
The local is so important.
Yeah.
In the search, go to your local historical society. So they try to pick somebody that's from where they are from, and that's really exciting.
Oh, absolutely.
The South Carolina African American Heritage Commission, on which I serve, has a number of books that they've published, and it's, you know, digital too, of lessons related to local historic sites in every county of the state. And they've assembled this over a number of years through teacher workshops. And so that, you know, teachers will come for a summer workshop and it's all paid for, and then they develop lessons, and then the lessons are compiled. And so like there's also stuff that's very, you know, place-based. So that here's even if you can't manage to pull the field trip together, you know, there's other resources of like, here's a spot that's very close to us, and, you know, ways to teach from, you know, from home, if
Where do
you
you
will.
find that?
Are they the ones that do the calendar?
Yeah, no, that's Bell South and
Yeah,
the Department of
and the
Education.
Department of Ed, and they have lessons to go with each and every
Right,
one of
right.
those.
But the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission is a separate state agency, very small, and, you know, everything that they get done is through grants. But these lesson plans are in cooperation. Several of the books are with the South Carolina Arts Commission. So it's place and African American history and the arts that are, you know, integrated. Their website is through the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, but you can just search SC African American Heritage Commission.
That's awesome, thank you.
I have a follow-up. So I, for some time now, have struggled with Black History Month, as well as months dedicated to other groups of people. And wondering, does that not continue, I guess, the narrative that Black history is somehow not American history, right? So if we separate this piece of history, or these groups of people, you know, Black history, women's history, Native American history, Hispanic history, all of that, does that not somehow perpetuate this narrative that that's somehow not American history, as American as George Washington and anybody else we study sort of the rest of the year? As Dr. Al said, you know, I too am Black all year long. All year.
I've been asked that, but do y'all wanna jump into that one? I can tell you what I've told teachers and what teachers have said to me. The thing is, you have some people who will still teach American history the way we were taught it. And so by having these separate months, kind of forces everyone to take a look at the different perspectives of cultures that make up America, our American identity. But at the same time, I hear you, because I've often asked, does it not kind of defeat the purpose if you have some people like, oh, well, I know we're talking about this right now, but I'm gonna save that for February. So I hear you, but I think it serves the purpose of, for those who may not do it on their own, to be forced to look at the different cultures that make up who we are as Americans. And that's really the big idea for teaching American history.
From my research, one of the things I've seen from African Americans who talk about teaching African American History Month is that don't only teach the history that happened, but also teach it that they didn't just sit by and let this happen, that there were revolts, that they did fight back, that they didn't just lay there and let this all happen. And I think that's important too.
I have a question about school psychology. So there's a lot of school psychologists that saying critical race theory causes some type of, or will cause some type of shame in the ego of children who's like growing up. How would you, what would you say to them? Because it's becoming a little bit bigger now. I recently had a professor even told me like, well, this been causing shame in children, our children, which I don't understand, but what would you say? Yeah.
Wait, are there actually,
I'm not a school psychologist.
are there really school psychologists who are saying that? Okay, all right, well, I don't know what to say about that.
I just don't know that they know what they're talking about. You know what I mean? People get into it and don't really know what it means, but it's a bandwagon to jump on.
Yes.
So, That's tough there.
Are they trying to say, like the part where, right, that first part in there in that bill was that one group can't be seen as inferior to another, and so they're trying to suggest that school teachers are teaching these kids that being white, they're inferior, and that's gonna hurt their feelings for the rest of their lives?
Kind of something like that.
Okay.
So what they do is they're trying to throw child development in there. So of course, when a child is growing up, you kind of have this ego, and the ego is, you really don't want to shame them, you don't want to make them embarrassed, because it kind of affects them mentally growing up, kind of makes them shameful. So what they're trying, a lot of school psychologists definitely, because I'm from Columbia and I hear less than two talking about this. They're proposing and insisting that if we teach critical race theory in our schools and in our elementary and middle schools, because this deal with child development, this may cause shame in white children, and this may cause some type of emotional, mental type of deal. And I first thought, when somebody told me that, I thought, you're insane. Before I even think about that, until I went down there and the school board meeting that they've been having, and then I heard a professor here, he was talking about it in my last semester, and in my classes, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Because my thing is, we teach slavery and whatnot, and I can learn as a child. I went back to my mom, like, well, you learn about slavery today, I kind of feel shameful of that. It seems like that is. So it is becoming a huge push, as some of the psychologists, and definitely in school psychologists, is trying to say that psychology has something to do with it, when indeed, that's not. I kind of like the idea of like white guilt, like they feel bad for being white, because white people did bad things in the past.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think you teach children that maybe that's true, and you accept that, doesn't mean you did it. It doesn't.
Right, that's
we
what
just
I was
work to make
thinking, you
things better.
can't personalize it. I mean,
It's a huge split right now in school boards. If you have like three parents, like, I don't want my kids learning, I don't want them to feel shameful about themselves. And then you have, of course, parents like, well, we need kids to learn this. It's a mess. I'm glad I don't have a child, that's all right.
I hadn't heard that, but thank you for bringing it to my attention.
That's what I was kind of trying to get at before, when I said like the white fragility reactions like
Yeah.
that, because I've been seeing that too. Of course, the videos of school board meetings, parents are going berserk over stuff like this, and I don't know, like if you expect like a third grader to learn about slavery for the first time, they're the only black student in class, every white student, anytime any African American is mentioned looks at that student. Do we stop teaching everything? Like how would you like explain this to a student?
But I think we need to be realistic about what's actually happening, right? Like, is it really the third grader that is experiencing all the distress?
No.
Or is it mama and daddy
It's the mom
when
and
they
dad
come
raising.
home with their assignment,
Yeah.
right? So I've seen, incidents here and there about, this assignment that a teacher gave was, that was probably pretty wrong-headed. I agree. I would not have been happy if that had come home with my child. But I'm not sure I believe that teachers are all that insensitive and clueless, right? I tend to think that teachers are caring and thoughtful and smart. And some of them are my students. And so I know what they learned in my classes, and that they're turning around and sharing that with younger ones, right? I have a pretty high degree of confidence that what's happening is that parents who have been politicized, and that was the problem I wanted to bring up earlier, that, tell teachers not to politicize things.
Right.
It is not the teacher's fault, right? The partisan political leaders and actors and special interests are politicizing everything, right? And teachers and kids are getting caught in the middle of battles that are playing out in state houses, right? And that are playing out in Congress, and that I'm just not comfortable with the idea that no, I'm not going to use that terminology, because it's not about comfort, right? I disagree with the idea that teaching history will cause fundamental emotional distress, right? I think that that sensitive, caring teachers teach history and help their students to face challenging realities, difficult realities. But a student who's experiencing distress over, some kind of confronting a racial identity, right, in class, what that student is experiencing is messaging that comes from their society and their parents and their grandparents, right? And they need to be able to process that. They need to be able to look at themselves. They need to think they need to face whiteness or face all the things that people have said about blackness, right? We need to face we have to, and teachers are in fantastic positions to do it. I just am not, I don't want to sacrifice the teachers along the way, right? And I think that we need to be realistic about that too, that like it is already a political minefield. It just is. We're entering kind of a climate where, doesn't matter what a teacher says, that the forces at work are gonna make it into something bigger than it was, right? I think it's a pretty dangerous situation. I think, in our state, I'm sorry I'm talking so long. Apparently I have some feeling. I'm experiencing emotional distress, and I'm going to share it with y'all. Like in that our legislature, and my only prayer is that these ridiculous bills just die in committee somewhere, because most bills do. And let's just, if you are a praying person, I say direct your energy towards just them being in the trash can. All right. That our legislature sees fit to spend time on bills like that, and yet has not seen fit to figure out how to fund our base student appropriation for decades, right? Like the fact that our legislature figured out how to appoint new people to the Supreme Court of the state in order to avoid the decision previously in the Abbeville case that would have forced the legislature to fully fund its own per pupil funding requirements. Like they have found all kinds of time, all kinds of energy to not fully and properly educate the children of our state. So to those who are entering the teaching profession, I guess I'm just like, it is a political act in that sense, right? To become a teacher. We are, all of us involved in education, I think to some degree, like fighting against the grain of this particular political moment. I mean, it's just dicey times. I'm not saying don't do it, but I think we also have to be realistic. We're already shedding teachers like we've got extras, right? Is any of this gonna make it easier to attract teachers to our profession? Keep them in the classroom? I mean, Lord help us all. Lord help us all.
Well, and I think Louis hits on something important here, that this isn't, I would argue, that this is not necessarily a matter about kids and education. But this is all political calculus. That it's political parties vying for influence and power and using teachers and educators as scapegoats. Mm-hmm. That's the moment in which we exist. That's the way that politics gets played, and that teachers are the punching bags right now. But I think we also have to be knowledgeable of the fact that we can navigate this moment in a way that could give us a positive outcome from the educational perspective. As it comes to dealing with students and these types of issues, what I find that it comes down to dealing with is like content and care, because we care about our kids, right? I teach big kids, but they're still my kids, right? In the same way. And that having those emotional responses to ugly things is expected, right? People know me around campus because I like to give big term papers. And I don't give a term paper in my race class because I make them do a journal. Because I want them to talk about these emotions that they're experiencing. Don't worry, you'll get a paper.
Are you saying that taking your class is a hard emotional experience?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I want to clarify.
But confronting these things is an emotional experience. And we have to allow people to process these things so we don't show up at school board yelling at folks. That walking through the path of the emotion is important whenever we're dealing with our history.
I agree 100%. I want to tell you that I agree with that 100%, and I will definitely do that with my own personal children. The issue is why we're bleeding teachers as if we have extra is the fact that it's become such a political minefield. We have legislators who haven't been in a classroom since they were students dictating what happens in one. And that is the issue. Teachers aren't treated as the professionals they are. We went to school, we earned the right and the certification to do this job. I don't see too many people question their doctors to death, about the care they give. And so I think that's what's happened. We've got so many opinions on what should and should not be taught that is causing teachers to feel as though they're not treated as professionals and they're not given the autonomy they need to do this. And that is they're not treated as competent. All of us who are teachers and those who are intending to be teachers care about the children who are placed in our charge. We are not going to do anything that is intentional to make any child feel uncomfortable. And if we face those issues where a child is feeling uncomfortable, we have a skill set available to help them work through it. But the concern right now is parents don't want their children, or the ones who are complaining like that, we have the issue, we don't want them to feel uncomfortable. Or if they are feeling emotionally uncomfortable, that should be the parent's job to deal with it. So I know you heard me say, talk about it with your parents at home, but that really is a save your job type response. And sometimes if you build rapport and you get to know families, they'll trust you to help their child work through those issues. But that's that fine line, that comes later on and with experience, and you just have to tackle that thing through the lens of other groups. You mentioned narratives, that is such an important part. I kid you not. I still read picture books, even to high school students, because when I'm getting to a topic that might be hairy, no one argues about a picture book. Well, I don't know, nowadays they argue about books. But that is a way, and using a benign issue. We had I can't remember who the guy was. He came to one of our state meetings and he was saying, how do we teach kids discourse? How do we teach them to disagree and about things? And he actually had us argue over whether a hot dog is a sandwich. Not, and so, and so then he took that very benign issue of hot dogs and turned it into something else. So if we're arguing over whether this hot dog is a sandwich or not, let's take it back to when we were arguing about how to represent the populations in our state.
Which is why we need social studies.
But it's getting pushed out all the time. I kid you not.
I know.
They're teaching social studies in so many ways.
or not at all?
or not at all, because we need to increase math scores or English scores, and, and that's how the gamut is run. But that's not just because teachers are deciding it or principals are deciding it. If our state report card, if, such a large percentage of how you are graded comes from ELA and math, and you're gonna spend your time on that. But what I've been saying forever is, especially to the younger grades, realize that social studies is a genre of literacy. And just like you're teaching English language arts, and I've had this discussion with teachers, and now we have with our ELA coordinator, and we're talking to teachers together and trying to start using the same language. I said, when we talk about periodization, that's the same thing as when you're talking about setting. And so once teachers begin to make that connection, that it's not different, we get a little more traction for teaching social studies. But sometimes we gotta kind of sneak it in, just showing how those historical thinking skills are the same things that we do across the gamut.
Okay, well, Julie has the last question. Thank you all so much for your discussion. I do, in my classes, when we have discussion, I make them all giving final thoughts. So I will ask each of our panelists to give us your final thought for us to take away for this evening. Anybody can start. I'll call on you, that's for your class. I know all your names, I will call on you.
Todd started, Todd should finish.
All right, so Dr. Couch, if you want to start us with the final thought.
Final thought. Final thought would be very simple. Just keep on going. That's all. Keep on going. Especially, I know there are several people that are education majors here. Keep on going. That don't let this current moment in which we exist dissuade you from pursuing your desire to be an educator. There's value in what's done in the classroom.
Honestly, I was thinking something very similar. I think, what better time to be alive than this one? There's so much change afoot, and every time you step out, every conversation is an opportunity to make progress. And so, in whatever capacity in society, whatever situation we find ourselves in, there's so much good to be done. Hot times calls for more heroes. Let's do it. Yeah, that could be a bumper sticker. Yeah.
I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that up. This is some good trouble getting from the words of John Lewis. And so we need you for our teachers to come on in and take up the mantle of teaching our children how to be those productive citizens. And it's a fine line, but you can walk it just fine.
All right. Our next talk event is March 2nd, the first Wednesday of March, and that is about entrepreneurship. So,
Thank you, Dr. Wright.
I learned so much.
One of the most